Good morning. Good Morning Nashville. This is Matt Bassett on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN. Thrilled to be with you this morning. In the studio behind the glass, we have Mac Morey. Mac, how are you?
Good morning, Matt. Doing great. How about yourself?
I am better than I deserve.
Oh, yeah.
And then we also have our good friend, Brother Ken Weaver, that will be bringing us all the top stories throughout the day. And Mac, today, I don't think I've ever been quite this excited to do a show. Our cup overfloweth as it relates to the level of talent for our guest pool this morning. And just to give people a little insight, I mean, we always try and bring you at Super Talk the most current, the most wise people to bring in and break down these issues, the people with the experience. But you know, it's a busy time in D.C. It's a busy time in many state capitals. And so you invite folks, but you know, sometimes it's feast and sometimes it's famine. But for today's show, it was almost going to be a challenge to get them all in. So just to kind of run through them in order, we have two of the smartest economists on the planet, EJ and Tony. Top medical mind, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, senior fellow on the Committee to Unleash Prosperity with Nashville legend Art Laffer and our friend of the show, Stephen Moore. He will be coming up at the bottom of the hour. He is going to unpack for us Biden's take on just how well he's doing with the economy. A little fact check or little reality check on what the economists are actually seeing and some very concerning warning signs and how we got to this point. So EJ is going to break that down and take us through all of that. You have seen him and read him pretty much everywhere. Daily Caller, Fox News, Fox Business, Wall Street Journal, National Review, Washington Times, Washington Examiner, Breitbart, The Federalist, and many, many others. Then at the top of the next hour, we're going to have one of my favorite people, someone I've known for a long time, DC insider Jim Frogue, founder of Frogue Clark Consulting. He worked for Newt Gingrich for 6 years and was a senior health policy advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign. And knowing him, he would point out that was the one that won. But we're going to take on this whole world of woke and this woke agenda that is being forced down all of our throats, and I'm about to lose my cookies over it. It's just driving me crazy. So we're going to get into all of that. And quite frankly, the backlash across America to have a small minority of people just pushing their agenda on us, and we're just supposed to accept it and say thank you and move on. And I think we just need to say nope. We're not going to do it. So we'll get into that. And then at the bottom of the hour, we have Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is a brilliant economist, executive vice president and policy chief with the American Legislative Exchange Council. He's been on all the shows, done all the papers. And every year, he authors what is called Rich States, Poor States. And so they break down all the states and talk about who has the best business climate to live in. I'm not going to give away how we did in Tennessee, so people will just have to stick around for that. We did well, but we didn't do as well as the state that ranked number one. And so we're going to talk about why that is and what he's seeing in all of those states. And then I'm very excited to have someone that I've worked with for over 20 years. He is a mentor to me, has been a wonderful friend throughout the year, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. And we are going to get into all the top stories today. We're going to talk about Title IX. He's going to tell us what we need to know on the debt ceiling fight and just so many other issues. We could have spent a whole hour with him. He's very gracious to give us the half. And then after that, because we're not done yet, Mac, we will have former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield, my colleague in the Trump administration. Think of Dr. Redfield, and he might not appreciate this, but I don't think he'd correct it, as the anti-Tony Fauci. So he is the one in the White House task force in the early days. And it's worth pointing out that he's a virologist. Okay. He is the actual expert on these. He's worked on MERS. He's worked on SARS. He knows what it looks like when a disease transfers from one animal to another animal and ends up in the human population. And he quickly pointed out that with COVID, that's not what this was. And he would speak out in these White House task force meetings and would get vilified, saying that he believed all the evidence pointed to the fact that it came from the Wuhan lab. And now all of these people on the right who were told that they were conspiracy theorists for tagging this line, he had leading scientists, Mac, in Europe. One of them told him the world would be better if he jumped off a building.
Wow.
For saying we should have a scientific discussion about this and we should be debating this in public forums. And it turns out he was right all along. And I was just thrilled when he called yesterday and said he'd love to be part of the program. So we're going to talk all about what actually went on with him in this White House task force, the battles that he fought with Dr. Fauci, why the scientific community was just so adamantly opposed to even considering that it might have leaked from this lab. And we're also going to talk about an issue he is passionate about, as is Senator Rand Paul, just to the north of us, is gain-of-function research. The dangers of that and the dangers that it still poses to our population today. So you're not going to want to miss that. He's going to be absolutely fantastic. And so I do want to just touch on a few of these stories and kind of prep you for what we're going to be covering with all of our guests this morning. And it will be, if we get a chance, I will always open the phone lines because I want to hear from you. But if you have questions for any of these guests as we're going through it, please reach out to Mac and I on the WTN hotline and text us. And that number is 615-737-9986, 737-WWTN. And to the extent that time allows, I will do my level best to get those questions into our guests. So just going through a few things that have broken in the last couple of days, or at least since I've been with you on Monday, I want to give a shout out to UK star swimmer and spokesperson Riley Gaines. Now, many of you are familiar with her story, standing up and defending women's sports, and she has received a ton of support. I got to say, my wife and I watched her last night on Sean Hannity. And the poise that this young woman has is absolutely unbelievable. It's like she's been doing media her whole life, and she has just become the embodiment of women and daughters everywhere working to protect women's sports. And she is getting support from all over the universe. Olympic gold medalist Donna de Verone spoke out on the need for a reasonable approach to the ongoing debate and called for everyone to support Riley Gaines, the former Kentucky swimmer who spearheaded the fight for women's rights in recent months. Many of you will recall Gaines was assaulted on the San Francisco State University campus after delivering a speech on protecting women's sports. She has faced severe backlash for her opinion that transgender athletes, specifically biological males who have transitioned to female, should not be permitted to compete in the women's division. And former gold medalist Verona said that she is not alone in this fight. Quote, "She has a lot of us veterans behind her. But where is middle America? Wake up, mothers and fathers, and start speaking out." Verona says that Gaines was muzzled and told not to speak out after competing against transgender swimmer Leah Thomas. Verona herself has worked on Title IX for 50 years. And we're going to get into this in detail because there's a bill moving through the House this week. She said that the overall understanding was that everyone can compete in the classroom, but that men and women need separate spaces when it comes to physical competition. And to finish out her thought, I don't think you'd see us dominate the Olympics, nor would you see professional basketball, nor would you understand the foundational values that sports offers girls as they move through life and find themselves in corporate America as leaders, as politicians, as astronauts. It's amazing what the sports experience can do for girls and women if they're offered a fair and safe environment. And I say amen to Riley Gaines, amen to Donna DeVerona, and for all of us standing up to the woke mob to protect women's sports. And we're going to get into this with Newt because he has his finger on the pulse of all this. And the reason that it's so timely is, and this is from Newt's newsletter that he points out, this Thursday, Americans will have an opportunity to see just how extreme the House Democrats have become. And a note from me, this bill passed out of the House committee completely on party lines. Every Republican supported protecting women's sports, and every Democrat voted against it. Congressman Greg, I'm not even sure how to pronounce this, Stubbe's Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, H.R. 734, will come up for a vote just before members go home this week. How many members will vote against opportunity for women and girls to compete without having their lives' efforts destroyed by men who decide they are female? And one of the points I want to make, it is way past time for us to be the silent majority. The other side is not silent. And, Dan Mandis made a great point on his program yesterday, and he was speaking in reference to the whole Bud Light and their transgender campaign. And he said, never do we see someone from the other side give anything on this. You don't see someone that says, I support Dylan Mulvaney, but I am against surgery on children. They never delineate that. You have to accept the whole woke thing or nothing at all. So I say, let's not accept anything at all. And again, going back to the phrase, nope. And here's the thing. A lot of people don't speak up because they're afraid that they're going to be called a prejudiced or whatever ist that the far left wants to put on you. But what you have to understand, these people are an absolute minority of a minority. Most Americans don't feel this way. One of the wonderful things that Newt does is he runs America's New Majority Project, and they put out polling on all of these issues to see where Americans are. And there are a couple key things from this that I wanted to share with you. As it relates to this subject, 73% believe a teacher or school should notify parents if a child says he or she wants to identify as the opposite gender. 73% also disagree with those who say that children should be able to receive so-called gender-affirming care without the permission of parents. Further, 72% oppose schools teaching children that they can change their gender, and 71% favor banning surgery on children to transition them, from one gender to another. In fact, 67% do not want teachers in kindergarten through third grade discussing gender identity with their students at all. And finally, 60% say it is a form of child abuse if a teacher or school encourages a child to change his or her gender identity. And for some reason, the only people who don't understand this is President Joe Biden and his administration, as they have consistently sided with transgender activists despite the widespread opposition of the American people. And I've covered extensively on this program that on April 6th of this month, the Biden administration released a proposed pro-transgender regulation that would effectively undo Title IX and which establishes protections for women's sports. I mean, I have covered this extensively with my state senator, Jack Johnson, with you. And this proposed rule, if finalized, would undo all of the legislation that we have passed in Tennessee, and that a myriad of other states have either already passed or are in the process of passing. I believe North Carolina just passed their legislation yesterday. All of this would undo what we have put in place, protecting high school girls and protecting college athletics for women. But again, we are not in the minority on this issue. So it's time to speak up. We're going to do a quick commercial break, and we will be back right after this on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
We are waiting to see if lawmakers pass Governor Lee's school safety plan today. Details at 9:30 on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
Thank you, Brother Ken. This is Matt Bassett back with you, and wanted to just touch on one or two stories before we get to the incredible lineup of guests that we have coming up. So we're going to have Dr. Robert Redfield talk about all of the medical side of all of the evidence that is breaking towards this came from the Wuhan lab in China. So I don't want to steal any of his thunder because it's way better to hear it from him. But I do want to talk about now where the intelligence community is coming on this. So I believe it is today, Director of National Intelligence under President Trump, John Ratcliffe, will be testifying in front of the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. And we got some of his comments early on this so we could see what he was going to talk about in the testimony. And I want to point out to you where he is on this. So he is expected to say that the Biden administration declared that the assessment that it came from the lab in China, that is, would have enormous geopolitical implications that they seemingly did not want to face head on. It doesn't seem the Biden administration wants to do anything about China head on, from the side, or really in any capacity. This is from his testimony. My informed assessment as a person with as much or more access than anyone to our government's intelligence during the initial years of the virus's outbreak and pandemic onset has been and continues to be that the lab leak is the only explanation credibly supported by our intelligence, by science, and by common sense. Radcliffe will explain that if U.S. intelligence and evidence supporting a lab leak theory was placed side by side with our intelligence and evidence pointing to a naturally occurring spillover theory, the lab leak side of the ledger would be long and overwhelming, while the spillover side would be nearly empty. Radcliffe will point out China's obstruction of investigations into the origins and will say China is incapable of offering a single shred of exculpatory evidence. The intelligence community sources for the information are numerous, diverse, and unassailable, Radcliffe will say. To this day, the CIA, unquestionably the world's premier spy agency with an unrivaled capacity to acquire information and near limitless resources to do so, has continued to state that it does not have enough information to make a formal assessment. To put it bluntly, this is unjustifiable and a reflection not that the agency can't make an assessment with any confidence, only that it won't. Radcliffe will also explain that the intelligence community makes thousands of assessments every year with a fraction of the intelligence, circumstantial or otherwise, that it possesses related to COVID's origins. And we're going to get into all of that with Dr. Redfield. Another story that I found in Politico, which I thought was interesting because it had a Tennessee tie, but we're going to save that until we get a chance. We're going to do a commercial break, and then we will be back with economist E.J. Antoni. Stay with us on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.
"9:30 on the dot this Wednesday morning. I'm Ken Weaver with your top stories. Another beautiful day on the way. There are changes coming. We'll tell you during the full forecast in 2 minutes. Right now in Tennessee, we're waiting to see if the State House of Representatives passes Governor Lee's school safety plan, which has been amended over the past several days. If it passes the House, Then it goes to the governor's desk. Here in Nashville, the resolution requiring Metro Police take over Metro's school safety plan was rejected last night by the Metro Council after school board members expressed concern it could expose weaknesses in school security to the public. But the author, District 26 Councilmember Courtney Johnston, tells WTN's Nashville's Morning News she thinks the board doesn't want accountability if it ever rejected police recommendations.
Not necessarily so much about the review itself, because the review always happens. It was the part that made it public.
That is the latest news. Weather is next. I'm Ken Weaver, WTN News.
Hi, I'm Paul Winkler. Have you ever thought about why we invest in the stock market? Well, you often hear because we want to protect ourselves from inflation. Well, what is inflation? It's prices going up. Who's raising prices? Companies. What do you own when you own stocks? You own the companies raising prices, so it helps protect us from that. The other thing is this. Think about the most successful people you know. They're typically business owners. And you get to be a business owner when you invest in the stock market. Now, if we think about the stock market, a lot of people worry about, well, what if the stock market drops and it never comes back? Well, this is another thing that I like to explain to people. If the stock market goes down and it never comes back, what does that mean? That means that earnings went down and they never came back up again. So earnings went down. If earnings go down, what else goes down? Taxes go down. If taxes go away, what else goes away? The government goes away. If the government goes away, the FDIC goes away. So think about it. Everything is built on the stock market. That's why I don't ever worry about the stock market going down. Everybody has the same goal in mind when stocks go down. Get it to come back up, because we got to get earnings to come back up. Now, you have two things at your control to get earnings to come back up. One is sales. We can change what we're selling or sell more of whatever we have if we can. And if we can't do that, we can reduce our expenses. And that's exactly what companies do. You'll notice that they lay off people when things get bad, and hence that is why the stock market has recovered from every downturn throughout all of history. Now, if you want to learn more about our approach to investing in financial planning, go to paulwinkler.com and set up a free 15-minute phone call, or call 615-851-1950.
And we're back on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN. This is Matt Bassett, and I would like to welcome on into the program a brilliant economic mind. His titles are almost too long. Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Senior Fellow at the Committee to Unleash Prosperity with friend of the show, Stephen. And EJ, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
Doing well, Matt. How are you doing?
I am better than I deserve. We have a beautiful day here in Nashville, and a great lineup of guests, and you are kicking us off. And I have read your work for years, and I explained earlier that people can find your work basically everywhere. But you've done a lot of writing on President Biden's stewardship of the economy. And you've pointed out that it's somewhat ironic that he's taking credit for slowing the inflation that he caused. And there was just one line that stuck out at me, and it said, Biden and the big spenders in Congress are now arsonists in firemen's clothing, taking credit for extinguishing their own inferno. Can you talk us through what you're seeing in the Biden economy, what we see here coming out of the White House versus the reality that we in real America are seeing every day?
Well, when you listen to the rhetoric, this is the greatest recovery that we've probably ever had, except that that's not what most Americans are feeling. And I think Kevin McCarthy really struck a nerve on Monday, I believe it was, when he talked about how much American families have lost under the Biden administration. So even though, for example, I have a piece I think coming out in the New York Post the next day or two that talks about this, even though the typical family has seen their weekly paycheck go up about $200, it buys $100 less of actual stuff, so that at the end of the year, you're well over $5,000 worse off just in terms of how much less you can buy. Again, even though you're getting more money. And how on earth did we get into this horrible situation? It's not that individual things are getting more expensive. Everything's getting more expensive, which means what you're using to buy those things, aka the dollar, has lost value. What causes the dollar to lose value? That would be the Federal Reserve printing trillions upon trillions of dollars for Congress and the president to spend.
And where does all of this printed money go? Because you've also written that there's about $6 trillion that's kind of sloshing around there. How does that come back into the economy, and what does that do as it relates to fighting inflation in the future? Do you think the worst is over for inflation?
Oh, I wish it was. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve has really painted itself and therefore the nation into a corner on this one. And the way I like to put it is they have the wolf by the ears, but they can neither hold him nor safely let him go.
Yes.
So to answer your first question, though, when the Federal Reserve creates all of this money for the government to spend, the government goes out and spends it, right? They spend it on all different kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons why in times of inflation, prices don't all necessarily rise together at the exact same rate. Certain things will spike before others because that very well could be things that the government is buying before they buy other things, for example. So, I mean, a lot of it has to do with things like energy policy as well, right? We've had terrible restrictive energy policy that's caused energy prices to spike, but neither here nor there. Prices increase irregularly at first, but as the government pays the private sector for goods and services, what happens? That money that it paid for those goods and services begins sloshing around the economy, and private individuals, you and me, we start buying things with the money that we've received, and so that money continues to circulate. But we also have one more problem, and that's fractional reserve banking, meaning when you put money on deposit at a bank, we oftentimes think that our money's in the bank. No, it's not. Almost all of our money immediately gets lent out to someone else, which creates additional money because the same dollar that you put on deposit in the bank can create many dollars worth of loans. And so what the Federal Reserve has been doing to try to stop that from happening is they're saying to banks, to hedge funds, to large financial institutions, they're saying, listen, park your money in our vaults. We'll pay you interest on it for you to do so. And then that way the money can't be lent out. It can't multiply. And that helps reduce the inflationary impact while still providing government with all that lovely free money to spend. The problem is that now, as interest rates have gone up, and as the balance that the Fed is paying interest on has gone up, it's $6 trillion now, the
Yes.
Fed has to create $800 million a day every day in order to try to keep this thing under control. They can't do that forever. They're now starting to fuel inflation in the name of fighting it.
Yeah, it is painful for everyday Americans when we have to fill up the tank, when we have to go to the supermarket. They see that inflation every day, and to have the White House act like they're doing a fantastic bang-up job in the economy, I take people back to the Trump economy pre-COVID. And do you remember when your 401k was growing versus today where there's almost nowhere you can park your money that is safe, including certain banks?
Right, absolutely. And again, people say, how on earth did we get here? We got here because in order to finance all of this government spending, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates too low for too long, and they created interest rate risk within the economy, a systemic problem. And in fact, it's not just at banks, it's at the Federal Reserve itself. The Federal Reserve has actually lost about $1.5 trillion on its balance sheet. In other words, if they had to sell off their balance sheet today, that's how much money they would lose. The Fed was the very first bank to go bankrupt.
But they get to keep printing, right?
Oh, right, exactly. And it takes a special kind of incompetence, by the way, to have a money printer and still lose money.
Well, where do you see it going from here? How vulnerable do you see the markets over the next 6 to 12 months?
Oh, it's a great question, and unfortunately, we don't really have a lot of clarity on that because this is such uncharted territory.
There are a lot of conflicting indicators, right?
True, that's true, but we also just simply are in uncharted waters. We really have never seen this before, so it's difficult to look back and say, okay, in the past when X, Y, and Z happened, we see 1, 2, 3 are the results. We don't have that kind of hindsight right now, and so as a result, it to a certain extent, we are very much dependent on what government does. In other words, if government actually gets its act together and actually reins in some of this spending, we can, for example, get rid of inflation without having to put interest rates through the roof. But if government is going to continue to go down this path of spending money we don't have, the pain is going to continue.
Well, let me ask you this. So obviously the Fed their goal is to have a soft landing or a mild recession. In your entire career in economics, have you ever seen the Fed get that right?
No, absolutely not. The Fed has never gotten anything right since 1913, for crying out loud. Matt, part of the problem is that the Fed is frankly driving fast at night with no headlights on. They are constantly using tools that take between 2 and 22 months to have their full effect, right? That's monetary policy in a nutshell. But they're using backward-looking data. And it's not even just so much the fact that the data they have takes a while to collect and everything. No, a lot of times the data they're looking at are not even great forward indicators. They're just indicators of what the economy, where the economy has already been, not necessarily where it's going to go. And as a result of that, this centrally planned type of monetary policy is not being anywhere near as efficient as millions upon millions of unpaid individuals who on their own collectively are essentially establishing monetary policy, which is what we used to have in the United States before the Federal Reserve's creation. Everyone together collectively, without even knowing they were doing it, were setting monetary policy by their own action. And we never had the kinds of violent swings in the economy. We never had the Great Depression, for example, before the Federal Reserve came along. Things have gotten worse, not better, since the Fed's implementation.
Yes. Yes. Do you have any hopes that a divided Congress, as we have, is going to come to any resolution on this? We have former Speaker Newt Gingrich that's coming up in the 11 o'clock hour, and we're going to get into the debt ceiling. But is there any hope for anything positive from the economic front coming from efforts from the House or Senate, or is that kind of a pipe dream?
No, I think we do have some. We think we do have some hopes here. We have seen some positive developments, but frankly, even if the government were to do absolutely nothing, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. If we bump up against the debt ceiling, that doesn't mean we're going to default on all of our bonds, bills, and notes. The Treasury has plenty of money coming in to pay all of those obligations, and it also has plenty of money coming in to pay for things like Social Security and Medicare. So all we're going to have happen is another partial government shutdown, which has happened plenty of times before. It happened under Newt Gingrich, and honestly, probably typically Americans don't even notice when they happen. Probably the most consequential event to ever come from a government shutdown was the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
Yeah, I'm very interested to get the speaker's opinion on that as well. Being a former Hill staffer, my sense has always been I can't think of a time when the government shut down and somehow, some way, Republicans were blamed for it. Can you? Or we're not blamed for it.
No, that's exactly right. And, unfortunately, Republicans, I think, have really failed on the messaging front here. I'm a monetary scientist, not a political scientist, so I suppose take this with a grain of salt. I'm getting a little out of my my territory here. But I think what Republicans need to do is frame this messaging as, look, government spending is robbing you of your wealth. And so if you want to stop that highway robbery, you need to stop the spending. The problem is that I think a lot of these Republicans are Republican in name only. And so it's up to the few conservatives in Congress, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to really hold the line here. I
think that's pretty spot on as a policy guy. But I also wanted to ask, as it relates to, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. Where do you see? How do you see this affecting markets in the next 6 months? And I know you're not a market analyst, but any kind of predictions on what people should be looking for?
Well, I think markets are facing a lot of headwinds, none of which really have much of anything to do precisely with the debt ceiling fight. But instead, what we're seeing is that the consumer is strapped for cash, right? The consumer is really running up against a wall here. Credit is tightening. I mean, it is very concerning what we're seeing, for example, with credit in auto markets. That's something that I warned about a month or two ago. And that contagion is going to continue to spread. But I will say one very important note on that. A lot of people are thinking, oh, these high interest rates are breaking things. They're bad for the economy. No. It was the low interest rates that broke things. It's just that the high interest rates are exposing what was already broken. Normalizing interest rates is not causing the problem. It's just exposing what was wrong. It's like saying, when I stop drinking and the hangover comes, I feel terrible. Therefore, stopping drinking is the problem. No, getting drunk was the problem. Getting drunk was the low interest rates.
Yes. And another thing that I didn't want to gloss over because you touched on it was as it related to energy and the impact of this administration's policy. We've covered that in detail here. But as it related to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, he raided it. Has President Biden filled it back up?
No, and that this is one of the things that has infuriated our former allies in Saudi Arabia is the fact that we promised them we were going to do it, and then all of a sudden Biden reneged on the promise. So then the Saudis turn around and say, fine, you're not going to play ball. We'll find other people who will. So they go to
Like China?
the other members of OPEC Plus, and they decide to cut production at the same time that Biden won't let production increase here at home. So now we're going to see energy prices rise in the coming months. I just looked through the report on import and export prices, the latest data on that, and it shows that those prices have really stabilized, come down in some cases, but it's almost exclusively due to energy prices coming down over the last year. That's all going to reverse, which means we're going to be right back on the inflation train.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that the former administration filled up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve when I believe gas was about $2.75 or $3 a gallon. And that reserve was set up for when we had true crisis abroad. You know, it started with the oil embargo in Iran and is only supposed to be when there is a foreign global crisis that can't be avoided. It was never meant for a self-inflicted energy shutdown and taking away our energy independence, which was the first that we had ever in this country.
Oh, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, instead of having about a month's worth of, as you said, that strategic energy reserve, instead, now we're down to, I think, less than 2 weeks or somewhere around 2 weeks, which means if China really decides to do anything in Taiwan, we're hosed. We're not going to be able to meet the demands of our military in order to actually have any kind of legitimate response. The reserve has basically been used not for a strategic purpose, but frankly for a political one.
Yes. Yes. EJ, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you being on, sharing your wisdom with our listeners. And I hope that we will be able to get you back real soon. Thank you for joining us.
No, Matt, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back on SuperTalk 99.7 WTN.